You're watching the Alistair Reign Armed Conflict channel, covering the war on terrorism, human rights, world politics, and military events. On October 4th and 5th, 2016, in Brussels, Belgium, European Union organized the Brussels Conference on Afghanistan. European Union High Representative spoke to the press on arrival.
Around 100 delegations, more than 70 countries, 20 international organizations, Secretary General of the United Nations, all gathered here in Brussels to express continued support to Afghan people, first of all, Afghan women.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg spoke briefly to the press.
NATO will not be part of combat operations. What NATO is doing is that we are training, and that's the role of NATO now, not to engage in combat operations, but to support the Afghans, as we have seen in Kunduz. The reason why NATO is in Afghanistan is that that's part of our efforts to fight international terrorism. The reason why we went into Afghanistan and the reason why we still are in Afghanistan is to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a safe haven for international terrorists. And that's the reason why it is important for us to strengthen the Afghan forces so they can fight Taliban, Al-Qaeda, other terrorist organizations.
He also took a moment to comment on NATO's new part in the war raging in Iraq.
We have already started training Iraqi officers in Jordan. We will soon start to train Iraqi officers in Iraq. And we will also start to provide support with AWACS surveillance planes to the international coalition fighting ISIL. All NATO allies participate in the international coalition. NATO provides support in different ways, and we will step up our training in Iraq. Iraqi forces are able to fight ISIL themselves instead of NATO conducting big combat operations. And that's also what I think one of the lessons we have learned from Afghanistan, is that for many, many years we conducted big combat operations in Afghanistan. But since 2015 we have only been in a support, assist and advise role. And I strongly believe that it is more viable, more sustainable to enable local forces to stabilize their own countries instead of NATO being engaged in big combat operations.
Sadly, there has been no mention of the U.S. soldier killed in action on Tuesday. The following is a press photo op of the power players at the Brussels Conference on Afghanistan. It appears that Ban Ki-moon is looking for something. Could he be looking for his lost self-respect? And was the NATO secretary just given the cold shoulder? The man whom can be 10 places at the same time, Secretary Kerry, was in attendance. And starring the belle of the ball, Afghanistan President Ashraf Ghani. But who invited Niles Crane? Just saying. The NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, delivers his opening remarks.
Afghan forces took over the responsibility of security in their own country. NATO is still providing support, and I think that the attacks we have seen this week in Helmand and in Kunduz shows that the Afghan forces are able to respond and are professional and committed to the task. 3 months ago, NATO heads of state and government came together in Warsaw, and there we decided together with partners to continue our support for Afghanistan's national unity government and its security forces. We agreed to sustain the research support mission beyond 2016 with around 13,000 troops. The mission will continue to offer training, advice and assistance, but with increased flexibility and also providing support where it is needed most.
NATO has extended Afghanistan's funding into 2020.
We agreed to continue to finance the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces to the end of 2020. The people of Afghanistan must be confident in the future of their country. That means greater security, increased access to schools, infrastructure development, and secure and trusted government institutions. And they must be confident that human rights, including the rights of women and children, will be fully respected.
So then, is this continued funding dependent on the release of child soldiers currently serving in government and police forces? The answer to that question is no. In spite of international laws, because of the ongoing conflict, Afghanistan continues to have a high number of child soldiers. Over 50% of Afghan population is under 18 years old, and due to poverty and loss of parents, these children are easy prey. Even though it is vitally important that the issue of child recruitment by terrorist groups and the Afghan security forces is paid more attention, ultimately, this is not only a child's rights issue, but also a matter of the country's future, as Afghan children will shape the future of this still broken nation. An additional factor is the high casualty rates of both Afghan security forces and terrorist insurgents, creating a constant demand for new soldiers. This is especially true with regards to the Afghan National Police in remote districts and the Afghan local police. Many of these children, mostly under 18 years of age, are also used to do hard physical labor, and many boys and girls are sexually abused by all these groups. These children are both taken by force or recruited by the Afghan police forces and the Taliban. The Taliban forces in Afghanistan have added scores of children to their ranks since mid-2015, in violation of the international prohibition on the use of child soldiers, Human Rights Watch said in February 2016. The following are a few highlights from John Kerry, the U.S. Secretary of State, talking about the progress made by the European Union in Afghanistan since 2001.
Despite the many challenges, and we've heard about them from each of the distinguished speakers thus far, I am genuine when I say that I come here with an enormous sense of confidence about the future. And the reason is partly because year by year, our shared effort, one of the largest international coalitions ever assembled and maintained over a sustained period of time, is in fact yielding encouraging dividends. And I ask everybody here to measure that. Each speaker has focused on one component or another of the changes in Afghanistan, but I just want to highlight a few others. Since we joined forces 15 years ago, it's hard to believe 15 years ago, but since 2001, maternal mortality in childbirth in Afghanistan has gone down by 75%. Average life expectancy has risen from 42 years to 62 years. Access to basic health care has skyrocketed from 9% to 67%. In 2001, there was only one television station, and it was owned by the government. Now there are 75 stations, and all but 2 are privately owned. Back then, there were virtually no cell phones, 0. Today, there are 18 million cell phones covering about 90% of residential areas connecting Afghans to the world. Now, everybody here understands the violence that has plagued Afghanistan for decades, and it has left very deep wounds, and those wounds will take time to heal, particularly when new attacks by the Taliban and other armed opposition reopen those wounds or simply refuse to let them heal. This conference today is another both remarkable and important demonstration of our strong commitment to the people of Afghanistan And it is, frankly, further evidence of our conviction that the progress made thus far is only the beginning. We know that Afghanistan is going to continue to develop socially and economically. We know the Afghan people are, broadly writ, committed to peace and security, and that is something that they have been denied for too long by a small group of armed insurgents. Last week, the Afghan government announced a peace agreement with a militant group headed by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, one of the country's most notorious figures. And the agreement requires Hekmatyar and his commanders to cease violence, cut all ties with their international terrorist organizations, and accept the Afghan constitution, including its guarantee of the rights for women and minorities. In return for keeping these commitments, Hekmatyar's group will be able to emerge from the shadows to rejoin Afghan society. A few years ago, the United States of America had 140,000 troops in Afghanistan. We are now down to slightly shy of 10,000. And Afghanistan's leaders are committed to and want a better future for their country. And they have demonstrated a rock-solid commitment to achieving self-reliance, and they have done so by holding themselves accountable to a standard of transparency and accountability that we all can measure. Where women are empowered to exercise rights, societies are more prosperous and they are more stable. That is true everywhere where you have women empowered and participating.
Of course, the misogynistic, Wahhabi state diplomats are not interested in human rights for women. Ms. Federica Mogherini, the EU High Representative, spoke on the subject of women's rights in Afghanistan.
It is really an honor for me to introduce this session of our conference on Afghanistan, dedicated to all Afghan women, to their talent and their hopes and their lives. I was just saying, President Ghani, this is probably the best way of starting our 2 days, dedicated to the international support to Afghanistan and the Afghanistan support to the Afghan people. The issue we discussed today is anything but a side issue for a side event. It's the core of our standards, how we can measure the way that Afghan people and Afghanistan have worked. Today we talk about women, but we also talk about the future of all Afghans, of an entire country. Because women empowerment is not only a matter of human rights and social justice, it is about development first and foremost. And it is about growth, including economic growth. It is about fulfilling the potential of Afghanistan, but of any other country in the world. President Ghani and the all Afghan government have been great partners in setting up this conference and in our common work on empowering women. But I believe none of all our great guests here today will complain if I thank particularly Madam Ghani for her leadership, for her dedication, for all she's doing for Afghanistan, all Afghan people. And we all know her commitment, in particular, for women empowerment. I will only mention the recent inauguration of the first all-women university in the country and the Trust Fund for Victims of Violence Against Women. But let me remind all of our audience, Madam Ghani, that your engagement in your country's life goes well beyond this issue. Your work has focused on internally displaced people, on people with disabilities, on all vulnerable men and women in Afghanistan. So your commitment truly shows that having women in leadership position is not just about women, it's about improving the living conditions of all, and I would like to thank you for that.
Yet, in Afghanistan today, honor crimes remain very high, along with many other forms of violence against women, and are increasing as traditional attitudes fail to keep pace with these economic and social changes. daughters have been replacing cash in Afghanistan and many other developing countries for centuries. Poverty has also led to high levels of child marriages, increasing the danger to young girls from death during childbirth and abuse from much older men and their families. This Afghan man had agreed to sell his 6-year-old daughter into marriage so he could pay his debt. There is very little accurate data on the number of honor killings since they are rarely reported. Women are targeted by family members for offenses like refusing an arranged marriage, seeking a divorce, alleged adultery, or even glancing sideways at a strange man. Finding safety is difficult because women who are fleeing their husbands or families are imprisoned or returned to their abusers. The U.S. officials should provide more support to Afghan women who risk their lives when they try to flee their abuser, especially considering that women's shelters in Afghanistan are 100% international donor funded. As well, the United States should put its visas behind its values. U.S. officials brag about their support for Afghan women, yet the U.S. Embassy in Kabul has shown no interest in granting humanitarian visas to women at risk of honor killings. Surely the U.S. can do better to ensure the protection of Afghan women and girls. His Highness, Prince Shah Karim Al Husseini, spoke on the good works the Aga Khan has produced in Afghanistan since 2001. Among the goals the Aga Khan works toward are the elimination of global poverty, including the advancement of the status of women in Muslim countries.
Since 2001, AKDN and its partners have channeled over $1 billion to enhance self-reliance and improve the quality of life of Afghans. Between now and 2020, AKDN plans similar investments in cultural heritage, education, energy, health, and poverty alleviation. First, it is urgent to drive efforts to sustain and develop Afghanistan's human and social capital. For this purpose, AKDN supports the Ministry of Education's National Education Strategic Plan in over 850 schools and education centers. In health, AKDN's public-private partnerships have provided treatment to over 1.6 million Afghans and trained over 13,000 doctors, nurses, and health workers. Supporting civil society is essential. Decades of experience have taught us that effective civil society is fundamental to lasting progress, helping ensure development that is inclusive and participatory. Civil society can unleash constructive talents from a broad spectrum of organizations and individuals, including the private sector. We are gratified to see these principles reflected in the Citizens' Charter adopted last week by the government.
And with a lot of handshaking for the cameras, the conference meetings commenced.
Well, why don't we shake hands for
Thank you.
Always. Thank you.
Subscribe to Alistair Reign YouTube channel for more news updates. Visit Alistair Reign news blog on the web, located at alistairreignblog.com.